Two people can see the same event and take away completely different accounts. This is an incredible truth about human experience. It's called perspective. Every year around August, I usually go to Dallas and meet with my Enneagram master teacher, and we hang out for a week. But my favorite part of that week is not that piece. My favorite part is in Dallas, every Thursday, every museum is free. And so my evening will be spent in different museums looking at art, but the Dallas Museum of Art has one of the most amazing children's wings that's called Uncrate. And at Uncrate, every experience of art is geared to teach children how to appreciate and see and acknowledge beauty. And about 4 or 5 years ago, when I was back in Dallas, they had this giant sculpture about the size of this stage, and it was all plywood cutouts painted in different ways on different sides. And as you walked around, there were 6 or 7 stations around this giant circle, and no matter where you were, it showed a completely different picture. Same piece of art, different picture. So you were looking this way, and the people that were seated around this table were smiling and happy, and you began to sketch and to draw that. But if you walked to this side, everybody had a little bit of a frown, and you were wondering what was happening at that party. And then you walked to the other side, and it wasn't even a party at all. It was a bunch of kids playing in a playground, simply done by an artist manipulating our perspective. Two people can look at a glass filled halfway with water, and one thinks it's half full, and the other thinks it's half empty. Two people can look at a small sum of money in their bank account, and one can have a panic attack, fearing that they've gone broke, and the other can shout for joy because they had more money than they thought they did. Two people can look at a failed business. One can throw up their hands and quit and never try again. And the other starts something new and uses the experience from the failure as the engine to start again. Perspective is the lens by which we see and assess the truths of our experience and our life. And perspective will shape 3 things, whether we like it or not. Your perspective will shape your understanding. Your perspective will also shape your attitude. And your perspective will shape how you respond. There is truly no better way to change our world or our relationships than by changing our perspective. Jesus teaches us this over and over, and so does Paul. Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, by changing your perspective. When you do, you will change what you understand, you will change your attitude, and you will change how you respond. So with a flip of perspective, what was once frightening can all of a sudden become exciting. Relationships that were once broken can be restored. Uncertainty in a moment can flip to confidence. Anxiety can be a rally cry for action. Perspective is powerful. And there's no more powerful perspective than the way that God sees the things around us. And Jesus is inviting us consistently to flip our perspective to the perspective of Christ. Our text for this morning that we got halfway through invites us to reconsider some things. In this life, our perspective, far more than our circumstances, really matter. In fact, I don't think it's even an exaggeration to say that our ability to see and properly interpret reality, our perspective, is almost everything. I don't know if you grew up with him, but I grew up with a guy named Paul Harvey. Anybody know Paul Harvey? If you don't, go down the rabbit hole on YouTube this afternoon and you'll thank me for generations. Paul Harvey had a radio show where he would start out and say, "I'm Paul Harvey, and now for the rest of the story." So now for the rest of the story on our scriptures. You remember from what Jeff read to us that there was this man who was blind. He was sitting around begging. And Jesus comes up and he spits in the dirt and he makes a little mud and he sticks it in the guy's eyes, which I think is a fascinating part of this story, by the way. And then tells the blind guy with the mud all over his face to go to the pool of Siloam. And he goes. And his friends, in the first part of the story, he comes back able to see, and his friends don't even know that he is who he says he is. But we pick up after this kind of conversation between him and his friends about Jesus, where he says, "So where is Jesus?" And I really want him to be more sarcastic in the scriptures and just say, "Dude, I was blind. How am I going to know where Jesus is?" Right? Like, you asked for one miracle, now you want a second? This is stupid. Like, why are you asking me? But he doesn't. He just says, "So where is he?" "I don't know." Right? Great answer. The scripture continues in verse 13. They marched the man to the Pharisees. This day when Jesus made the paste and healed his blindness was the Sabbath. And the Pharisees grilled him again on how he had come to see. And he said, "He put clay paste on my eyes, I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "Obviously, this man can't be from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath." Others countered, "How can a bad man do miraculous things, God revealing things like this?" They were split in their ranks. They came back at the blind man. "You're the expert. He opened your eyes. What do you have to say about him?" I love how he becomes an expert in 1 second, right? He said, "He's a prophet." The Jews didn't believe it. They didn't believe the man was blind to begin with. So at this point, they go to the parents of the man, now bright-eyed with sight, and they asked him, "Is this your son, the one you say was born blind? So how is it now that he sees?" His parents said, "We know he's our son. We know how he was born blind, but we have no idea how he came to see. We haven't a clue about who opened his eyes. Why don't you ask him?" Good job, parents, just throwing him back out there again. "He's a grown man and he can speak for himself." His parents were talking like this because they were intimidated by the religious leaders who had already decided that anyone who took a stand that this was the Messiah would be kicked out of the meeting place. And that's why his parents said, "Ask him. He's a grown man." They called the man back a second time, and the man who had been blind, and told them, "Give credit to God. We know this man is an imposter." He replied, "I know nothing about that one way or the other, but I know one thing for sure. I was blind, and now I see." They said, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And the man says, "I told you over and over and over, and you haven't listened. Why do you want to hear it again? Are you eager to become his disciple?" Now he's getting snarky. I like it. With that, they jumped all over him. "You might be a disciple of that man, but we're disciples of Moses. We know for sure that God spoke of Moses, but we have no idea where this man comes from." And the man replied, "That's amazing. You claim to know nothing about him, but the fact is, he opened my eyes. It's well known that God isn't at the beck and call of sinners, but listens carefully to anyone who lives in reverence and does his will. That someone opened the eyes of a man born blind has never been heard of, ever. If this man didn't come from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything." They said, "You're nothing but dirt. How dare you take that tone with us?" Then they threw him out in the streets. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and he went and found him. He asked him, Do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man said, point him out to me, sir, so I can believe. And Jesus said, you're looking right at him. Do you not recognize my voice? Master, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped him. Jesus then said, I came into the world to bring everything into the clear light of day, making all distinctions clear so that those who have never seen will see, and those who have made a great pretense of seeing will be exposed as blind. Some Pharisees overheard him and said, does that mean you're calling us blind? And Jesus gets really snarky. I like this. He says, if you were really blind, you would be blameless. But since you claim to see everything so well, you're accountable for every fault and failure. So first, after the man born blind receives his sight, even his own friends don't recognize him. They weren't even the blind ones. And in spite of the protests, he is who he says he is. Isn't that odd? That people who knew him well as a blind beggar man couldn't recognize him once he received his sight? Or maybe it's not that odd at all. How often, I wonder, do we define those around us in terms of their disability or their shortcomings or their challenges or their deficits? When I was in Minnesota, we had an entire service built around those with different special needs. We called it parables. And we called it parables because they were the parable to us about the real way of Jesus. They weren't Down syndrome. They weren't their special need. They were God's chosen voice. How often do we see the woman on the street and we proclaim that their identity is homeless? Or that man is divorced as their identity? Or she's a single mom? Or he's a high school dropout or a failure? Or she's an alcoholic? Or he's cancer? Or he's depressed? This practice isn't just limited to others, right? We do it to ourselves as well, allowing our past setbacks and disappointments to shape how we understand who we are. We seem to have a penchant for defining ourselves and others in the terms of our problems rather than our possibilities. And so the friends of the man born blind have defined him. And because they've defined him as one thing, they can't see him for who he's become. Second, when word of this young man's transformation reaches the authorities and they're dissatisfied with his testimony, they call his parents. Even members of the man's own family distance themselves from him. Right? And I think this is a beautiful metaphor for how our systems react to change and often hold perspectives to avoid the truth. Whether we're talking about our community or our nation or our neighborhood or our congregation or our family, when a system organizes itself around a defined problem, it has a difficult time moving to health. Even unhappy and unhealthy systems tend to prefer a known problem to an unknown solution. How many of you have worked in companies where you're like, this is just what they do, right? It's the same circle over and over, making sure the problem stays the problem. There's a story about scientists who took some monkeys, 5 monkeys, and they placed them in a cage as a part of an experiment. In the middle of the cage was a ladder with bananas on the top rung. And every time a monkey tried to climb the ladder, the experimenter sprayed the monkey right in the face with icy water from a little tube. Eventually, each time the monkey started to climb the ladder, the other monkeys would pull the monkey down and beat him up so that they could avoid being sprayed in the face with water. Soon, in that group of 5, no monkeys would go up the ladder anymore. The experimenter then substituted one of the monkeys in the cage with a new monkey. And the first thing the new monkey did was try to climb the ladder to reach the bananas. After several beatings and attempts to reach the bananas, the new monkey learned the new social norm. He never knew why the other monkeys were beating him up because he was never sprayed with water. But he quickly learned that the behavior would not be tolerated to go after the thing that he was genetically made to go after. And so he just stays at the bottom of the ladder. One by one, the monkeys in the cage were substituted for new monkeys until none of the original group remained. Every time the new monkey went up the ladder, the rest of the group would pull him off, even though they had never been sprayed. At the end of the experiment, the 5 monkeys in the cage had learned how to follow the rule. Don't go for the bananas, the thing that you were made to go after, without any of them knowing the reason of why. Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. When they removed those 5 monkeys and brought in 5 new monkeys that had never had any experience, those monkeys never went up the ladder. Because even the space held the memory. And so the man's parents, fearful of the consequences of their son's sight, play it safe and they distance themselves from their own personal monkey. Third, the man who sees, notice how easily it is for us to label him the blind man even after he sees. The man who sees is eventually kicked out of the community. So also in many of our own communities, the move toward healthy change and new identity is sabotaged. Our warped identities are at least well-fashioned, and so even though they serve us poorly, they're at least familiar. We've learned to cope with our limitations even as we resent them. And so out of fear, we often resist, if not reject, those who invite us into new identity, new perspective, new possibility. In this story, the cost of acknowledging that this man was cured by Jesus, that is, acknowledging that Jesus was sent by God, was simply too great for those in authority. So they deny it, and they deny that it even happened. And when that fails, because they can't deny it, because there's this guy who was blind that can now see, when that doesn't work, they do what they know how to do, and that's just kick him out. One of the hallmarks of the Gospel of John is that when Jesus arrives on the scene and in our lives, things change. Limitations fall by the wayside with the one who can turn water into wine. There's no need for sacrifice because the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world is here. Divisions and their corresponding ethnic definitions between Samaritan and Jew fade away in the presence of the one who offers living water. And the one who can heal even a man born blind is the one who offers not just life, but life in abundance. When Jesus comes into our picture, things change. Now that sounds really good until we realize that change is always disruptive. And then we wonder whether the change or even the promises of new life is worth it. And yet, and what is my favorite part of the story, this man who's never seen Jesus because he was blind before he got mud in his eyes, It's kicked out of the space, and it says that Jesus sought out the man and found him. Jesus sought out the man who sees and confirmed him in his healing. And he invited him into a new identity, an abundant life. So also the Lord of life seeks us out, rebuking all those who steal or limit our identity, even when we do it to ourselves. And then invites us into rich and abundant life. Our author of this series we're going through, Michelle Kushat, says this. She says, pain shrinks our world so that all we can see are the circumstances right in front of us. But the practice of perspective helps us to see the world beyond our own. Rather than seeing our story to the exclusion of all the others, we want to view the struggle in context of the bigger story. Although the practice of perspective doesn't make our losses any more or less real or valid, it opens our eyes to a big world in need of rescue and a God who's given everything just for that. See, the room that day was full of perspectives. And they were meaningful perspectives. The religious leaders weren't trying to be jerks. They just had been given this idea that had so implanted in their identity that they couldn't imagine that that idea may not be true and may not be serving them in the light of meeting Jesus anew. And the parents had a perspective that was just of fear. They couldn't even imagine what it would look like to not be a part of the community. And so they would lie about their own kid and push the responsibility on him because they didn't want to lose community. Even his own friends, right? We're like, I just don't know what to do with this, right? I know you as the blind kid. You were my friend. Help you beg. All's good. But I don't know. I don't know what to do with this. I want to warn you that when Jesus comes, he changes things. And those changes can be hard. But goodness, they're also life-giving. For what Jesus wants for us isn't just survival and persistence and getting by, or any of the other ways we've formulated and excused living half lives. What Jesus wants for us is life full and rich and abundant, the kind of life that stems from knowing that we have infinite worth in God's eyes, and that we will always be God's beloved child. And that is the identity and the perspective from which all things come. Please pray with me. God, help us to be open to change, to new perspective, to new ideas in our families, in our jobs, in our lives, in our nation, and in our world.